This time on the Magick Kitchen Podcast, we are talking about mythology. We're talking about the progression of mythology, and we're going to do some storytelling. So stay tuned. I'm Leandra Witchwood.
And I'm Elyse Wells.
And welcome to the Magick Kitchen Podcast, where we talk about magic, kitchen witchcraft, herbs,
and everything in between.
Serious practitioner teetering on the cusp of progress, it's time to step into true spiritual mastery. This is your invitation to join the Gardens of the Mystic Initiation and Certification Program, where I offer practitioners like you advanced teachings and guided experiences. Sign up now at leandrawitchwood.com or find the link in the show notes to learn more. Embrace your higher calling. Your journey awaits.
The biggest thing we want to really get into is how to decolonize our mythology understandings, to look at these myths and understand them in the context of the time that they were translated, because 9 times out of 10, more than that, really, I want to say it's 100% of the time, we're reading mythology from cultures that did not write them down in English. So we are always in the West, in English at the least, reading texts that are translated. And so the different translations that we come across are going to affect how we explore them. And the time period that they were translated in also affects a lot. And so often people conflate mythology with theology.
Yeah.
And the difference is that mythology is stories of the gods. Theology is who the gods are.
Yeah.
And theology is studied in 2 contexts majorly. You've got the literature, the written record, and we have archaeological evidence. At the end of the day, that's it. That's the 2 categories of knowledge we can possibly have. The third category, and that's why you're listening to a spirituality podcast, not an archaeology one,
right,
is personal gnosis. And what's incredible is if you've worked with deities of any variety, even if it's just been in a public ritual where someone called in Kali or something, you're going to know that there's a feeling to these entities. And that is the first thread to begin following when you want to find out who they really are. And mythology, surprisingly, is not always the best source of who an actual deity is, especially as we get more into the modern era. So, yeah, if I have more to say on that, but
well, I like to look at mythology the way Sharon Blackie does, as an ever-evolving storyline. It's not going to be the same because of our social political climate. They're going to evolve. We cannot look at a deity, a personification of an energy that's 5,000 years old and 100% say this is how it is. It's too dogmatic. There's too much of this. Well, that's the way they told it, so that's the way it is. But how do you know that? You don't know that's the way they told it. That's the way you heard it. That's the way it was told to you.
Yeah.
I've heard many different versions of the Persephone and Hades myth. I've heard many different versions of all Achilles myth. Just like look at all these popular myths, these known myths that we retell. And depending on who tells the story, it's going to be a little bit different. It boils down to how you perceive things. We were just talking about literacy in reading and comprehending what you read.
Yeah.
What you comprehend might be different than what I comprehend. And it's colored by our personal experiences in life. It's colored by our education comprehension, our reading comprehension. There's a lot to it. So when we look at mythology, we should always be taking it with a grain of salt and understand that it's maybe not the full story, maybe even not a snippet of the story, but it is a version of the story. And it's typically personal to the teller. Like I'm going to tell a story towards the end of this it's a personal story to me because of all the research that I've done. This is the story that I have come up with and the story I tell. It still captures the essence of the personification of these deities, but it tells it in a different way so that it relates to my path and my experience with them. And I think that's a real key thing. What is your personal gnosis when you're experiencing these stories? And don't take it as literal. Like none of this is literal. This is all spiritual. It's not literal. It's not meant to be literal. We have no Bible telling us this is this, that is that. And that's a good point to make. Even look at those who interpret the Bible. They all interpret it differently. They're all the same words there. It's all the same. But look at the different styles of expressing those words. The different styles of how people put their personal agendas in with these words and manipulate them in that way. It happens all the time. And that is an actual documented thing. Like the Bible is documented. We don't have all these documented things because a lot of us come from cultures, our ancient cultures, where we take these mythologies. It was all verbal. And it was meant to be an ever-evolving storytelling experience.
Yeah. And I think the thing to consider is all the translations we read have been translated by non-followers of these gods and goddesses, all of them. I think the only exception could perhaps be Emily Wilson's recent translation of the Iliad by Homer, because she is a feminist at the least. I don't believe she's a pagan by any means, but at least she is looking to empower women, whereas actually in every other translation we have, that was not a concern of the dusty old white guys who were doing that translation. So that's why we use the term decolonization. These myths, let's talk about the Norse for a second. The Norse Edda, the Poetic Edda, what we know about our gods literally comes from one monk meaning Christian, 1,100 years into Christianity. Between the year 900 and 1100 is when we have the source for these myths, and it's one person, one singular person. And what do we really know about Norse cultures, Scandinavian cultures? They were tribal. So while everybody, most likely, we don't know even this for sure, but most likely they had an understanding of Thor. We've been able to find Mjolnir necklaces all the way up into the ice shelf. So we know that they knew who Thor was archaeologically. This is why I love archaeology. It's so helpful for us as pagans. But we don't know the myth that they told around the fires. We don't know what the prayers were that they said. We don't know the practices of Seder. We know Freya gave them to us, but we don't know what they definitely are.
Right. Yeah.
So we eventually, I promise you, no matter where you're at on your journey, know that this is coming. Personal gnosis will have to be your guide at some point because you will hit a wall on the academic archaeological side. I know my master's degree is in spiritual studies. I spent years saying to myself, how, why, when, where? And I was like, you know what? Let's get a degree in this and let's find out. And guess what? Spoiler alert, I'm still searching. I finished that degree in 2021. You know, I'm still here on the path of exploration of who these deities are, what lessons they have for us. When it's any deity. The myth I'll share is Inanna, my patron goddess's myth. But know that going in, that any mythology you read is going to be, it's going to be skewed. Another example of that is the Celtic myths. They actually were never written down until quite modern, like James Fraser, Golden Bough. So we are pulling from very, I don't want to call them falsified, but fanciful. I mean, James Fraser was like, oh, this is fairy tales. And he just had fun with it, which, he wasn't writing it as a religious text. So I'm no shame. We're our ancestors, our witch ancestors, our spiritual lineage are the ones who ran with it as spiritual texts. And that's something to remember too. Like, what was the intention of the person writing this translation you're reading?
Right. And we have to think about like how we perceive a lot of the tales that we retell and that we associate with have very modern anchors. Like the idea that fairies have wings didn't show up until 1917.
In drawings, too. It was just because of how they decided to draw them. They're not even described with fairy wings.
Right. Right. It's just how they decided that's how it was going to be.
Mistaken. Yeah.
I can't remember. I just read the article and I can't remember all of it. And, but like I found that very interesting that, you know, what we think, what we believe, what we perceive as truth, as the way it is, you know, this is the way for all of you Star Wars fans out there. But I use that one as tongue in cheek because it's not always the way. It's not always how it's been. And that's okay. It's okay for us to evolve a little bit in our storytelling. It's okay to have these stories suit our current experience and our current paradigm. And I think that's where we get stuck is like, well, that's not how it's told. That's not how it's supposed to be. Well, it is though. If you were in Celtic cultures before they began writing things down, if you traveled from clan to clan, they would have told the stories slightly differently. Their experiences would be slightly different. There was even a suggestion out there in an archaeology magazine. This was years ago, so I don't have the citation for it. But the theory there was that the deities that show up in Celtic culture, some of them were actually just ancestors that were worshipped after their death, and they became deity. And it's a cool thing to think about. 'Cause like, oh, that opens my mind up to a little bit more. It broadens my perspective just that little bit more. Like, wow, okay, so this could have been an actual person, like Jesus. Like, he was an actual person, then now he's the Messiah. So we have to really get critical in our thinking rather than just accepting things as is. We have to question. We need to.
Yeah.
That's part of our path.
This is really crazy. But when I was in my bachelor's degree, my bachelor's degree is in English language arts and education and history. I got 3 degrees in one because I'm crazy. And the English language degree, we had a required course called the History of the English Language Arts class. Like, how did it begin as a course? And something that blew my mind, and I think about it all the time. I probably took this class like math a long time ago, 12 years ago, 11 years ago. I still think about this all the time. Critical thinking skills were not taught in schools. They weren't part of Common Core until 1992. So even anyone growing up who graduated before that, you actually didn't learn them, which is insane to imagine for me. But because we start in 6th grade now with critical thinking skills. So look it up. Like, if you're listening and you're like, oh, I'm a critical thinker, like just look it up and see what critical thinking skills are. You know, it's things like inference. It's things like, the literary devices like metaphor, allegory. And the other part of critical thinking that was not accepted until the 80s at all, like it was considered wrong. Imagine that. It was considered wrong to consider the context of a work in its historical period. So imagine reading To Kill a Mockingbird and not being able to talk about segregation. Like, that didn't matter to the story. You're just supposed to learn about Scouts' enjoyable experiences with whatever. Like, it's like, how would you even talk about that book without talking about the laws and the history and who was president and how he cared and didn't care about segregation? So all that to say, just put my English teacher hat on that I very rarely put on anymore. There is a pretty incredible shift in the way we are taught and not taught. And I don't think people realize that. And it is directly related to how witches experience their spiritual path. So go on YouTube, watch a couple of those Course Hero, or no, what's his name? I used to recommend him to my students all the time. John Green's brother, Hank Green, has videos for helping you learn English language arts and social studies. And one of them is about critical thinking, and it's fantastic. So literally, it's crazy. Like, you'll be like, oh, wow, I didn't realize that's not something everybody knew. Or you might be like, oh, I didn't know that was a way to view literature.
Right. And you see it in the cultural divide, in the social divide between older generations and younger generations.
Yes.
And I honestly, I don't know how I developed my critical thinking skills. Maybe it was because I was a feral child and I had no choice but to question people or else I was in danger. And that's been something that I teach heavily within all of my classes is go out, explore it, question it. Why does it matter in this context? And what does my perception of it, how is that coloring how I perceive it? How does my experience color my perception of it? Mm-hmm. And it'll blow your mind. You'll suddenly like see the world in a very, very different light. It'll be very different to you. And do this. And one of the easiest ways that I do this and this is how I gauge if I'm growing as a person, growing on my spiritual path. I will go back and I'll read a book that I haven't read in a year or so, mm-hmm. maybe even 5 years. And if it means something different to me now than what it did before, I know I'm growing. I know I'm developing myself.
Yeah.
So when you go back to these stories in a year and you read them again, and maybe there's something missing that you can ad lib into it, or maybe there's something you find the plot hole, or you find the that anchor point where you're like, oh, okay, that meant that to me a year ago. Now it means this to me. Okay, I know I'm growing. I know I'm using my critical thinking. I'm developing as a person.
Is your intuition tugging at you to deepen your relationship with your higher self? Do you feel like there is a greater mystery to your spiritual path and you're ready to go back to the roots of earth priestessing to discover it? Are you dreaming of caves, bowls of red roses, or having visions of barefoot women in white gowns? The priestess path is calling to you. This is an invitation to call on the oracle and be anointed in the Pythia's sacred spring at Delphi. I am inviting you to dance with the nymphs to the beat of my drum in an ancient forest. Let's meet the muses in the olive groves, swim with the mermaids, release your fears, and embrace the power of the priestess you know you are meant to be. If you're ready to meet the land spirits and oracles of Greece's most famous sacred site and beyond, visit seekingnumina.com/Delphi retreat and sign up to join me. Before we get into the stories that we were going to tell you, we have one last thing I wanted to touch on, which is that many of the myths are presented as if they were a translated version, but they're actually a Jungian approach to that myth. And there's a long scholarly history to why that happened, but the shortest version is that Jung he basically invented archetypes. He's the first man to write about that. And when he was writing these archetypes, he used ancient written texts to exemplify the archetypes, and the versions he told were quite skewed, but people took them as fact because of who he was. And so people were going back through the history and just kind of took him as a primary source for ancient mythology, which is quite silly. And again, it's part of this literary history of evolving to incorporate critical thinking, for example. And so all of that happened early on, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. We start seeing books like When God Was a Woman by Merlin Stone, or Carol Christ. I forget her book now. Diane Volkstein, she wrote a book on Inanna that just basically took the Jungian perspective as raw fact. And so this happens again and again and across every culture in the 70s and 80s, where we see this like amalgamation where everyone's just like, there was one great goddess. And that goes back to Margaret Murray as well, and her excavations in Egypt that like gave her downloads that she wrote as fact. You know, nothing wrong with sharing personal gnosis, but she wrote them as fact, and it would take another 65 years for them to be debunked. So anyway, so all of that is where these myths sometimes come from. So for example, the myth of Persephone's descent, you might have only ever heard the version that she chooses to go to hell, Hades, underworld. And when she goes down there, it's like a rebellion against her mother. That's a totally valid interpretation, but that's actually the Jungian interpretation. So I would actually, if there's a myth that you hold dear, I would just go to Google, type it in and say Jungian version of, translation of, and just see the differences, because I guarantee you'll learn something from both of them. And it's not to invalidate Jungian understanding, but I think a lot of people are missing that link, that like, oh, that's why the myth suddenly shifted.
Yeah.
It was good old Jung.
Oh, and Joseph Campbell played a big role in that too.
Yeah, he built off of Jung in the early 1900s.
So the two of them, they really colored how we view storytelling and the progression of it. I went through a course that did the shamanic side of it, which is still laced with Jungian theory. So
yeah. And so that's that. Like, we're definitely not denigrating those pieces of it, but we do need to know a little bit. Like, even if we are going to take the Sharon Blackie or the Clarissa Pinkola Estes route and just like write our own versions, that's fine. But know that they're your own versions. Like, I think what's always rubbed me the wrong way about Joseph Campbell and et al., all his friends, is that they didn't say that. They just said, this is the truth. Right. And that's quite the rich white man thing to do, isn't it? So that's the decolonization of it, is deciding to recognize that and saying, like, actually, like Inanna's myth is the perfect example. The original writer of her myths was her high priestess, Enheduanna. And that's where we have our primary source. That's the version. If we want to know a primary version, that's the one. It's her high priestess at Ur. It's not Joseph Campbell. But if Joseph Campbell's version speaks to you, that's probably Inanna too.
Yeah. And there's nuggets there in all of the versions. There's something there that speaks to the truth of the myth. And I use that loosely because I think, again, we're going back to personal gnosis, like the truth of, like, we're getting to...
Truth is always subjective.
Too rigid.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is. And again, it's going to be colored by your experience, your perception, the color glasses that you wear every day is going to make the experience different. It's going to make the meaning a little bit different, which is why I think it's important for us to take the value from these and use our critical thinking and use our own personal gnosis to create these myths that suit us in a better way or in a more coherent way, really.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think another way I look at gods and goddesses is like Mickey and Minnie Mouse. Walt Disney was asked, so are Mickey and Minnie married? Because in this cartoon, they're married. In this one, they don't seem to know each other yet. Yeah. They're falling in love. And he explained that in real life, yes, Mickey and Minnie are a soul bond. They are married, but they play roles to help us be entertained, learn lessons. Because we forget, like, our ancestors, what were they doing? There was no Netflix. Like, they were entertaining each other with these stories. These were entertainment. And so imagine, like, I just love the Norse myths because they're just so fun. So I keep thinking of them. But, like, imagine, like, you guys just finished a really hard battle. Maybe you lost some friends and family in that battle. You're around the fire eating some meat, and you're just a bit downtrodden. And someone says, have you ever heard the one about Loki and the salmon? And he says, what?
Yeah.
And then they're telling a story. Like, it gives me chills, honestly, like, to think of our ancestors talking about these stories that way. And, like, you can just hear the raucous laughter around the fire, Like, he did what? He took her hair? She was bald? Like, like, it's just, these myths are so entertaining for a reason because they were entertainment. And the gods are playing roles to either get a lesson across and or to entertain us.
Right. And that's the real takeaway. It's like, okay, where am I learning the lesson and where was I entertained? Where did I enjoy the journey?
Yeah.
Definitely. Sometimes finding quality resources we can actually use on our path is a real struggle. This is why I offer workbooks, journal prompts, free courses, on my website every month. Go to leandrawitchwood.com and click the links page to see what resources I have available.
Okay, everybody, it is now story time. So buckle in, get yourself a cup of tea. If you want to pause at this moment and then come back for story time, you can. This is where I'm excited because this episode I got to put on my English language literature hat, and now I'm putting on my theater teacher hat. And I am going to tell you the story of Inanna's descent. And this is the version of the translation, not the Jungian version. So this might not be the version you've heard before.
Right.
One day, Inanna I should start here. The battle ended, and Inanna wiped the blood from her brow. She looked around the field and saw, to her shock and awe, that the bull of heaven, the husband of her sister, Ereshkigal, had fallen. And she takes a moment to process this. She goes to Anu, who had given her the right to ask him to fight for her, the bull of heaven. And she says, I'm going to visit my sister. And Anu sort of gives her the side eye, like, okay, you know that's not a good idea. And she's like, yes, but my sister is pregnant with her first child. And she's now lost the father of her baby. And I want her to hear the news from me. So she goes to her temple and she gets her best friend and loyal confidant and perhaps also high priestess. We don't know all of her titles, Ninshabar. And she says, Ninshabar, bring your drum. We're going down to the underworld. And she tells her servants and Dumuzi, her husband / consort, because no one can tie her down. He's her consort, that she'll be gone for 3 days and 3 nights. Keep an eye on things. And her and Ninshabar go to the opening of the underworld. And she instructs Ninshabar that if she does not return in 3 days and 3 nights, to drum her home. And so she begins her descent. And Inanna will come to 7 gates in this descent over the 3 days and 3 nights. At the first gate, she is met by the guards, and they ask her why she's coming. And she explains, to visit my sister Ereshkigal, to pay tribute to the bull of heaven. And they say, okay, well, we can't allow you to come here so heavily armed. So covered in protection, because she's wearing her finest robes. She's wearing her most beautiful jewels, her highest crown, her tallest heels, her longest dresses, really showing up as the queen of heaven and earth that she is. And so she takes off her robe and she continues to descend. And at the next gate, they say the same. You must be stripped. You must be made vulnerable. And so she continues through these gates, taking off layers and layers until she arrives before the throne of her sister. And Ereshkigal is in agony. She's agonizing because the love of her life is gone. He never will get to meet their son. And now the woman who is to blame for his death is before her. And Inanna tries to speak with her sister, but Ereshkigal doesn't buy it. She says, I know you fooled Anu. You probably fooled Enki and all the other gods in our pantheon. But I know you're here to gloat. I know you're here to take my power. And she kills Inanna. Ereshkigal kills Inanna. And she hangs her body on a hook to rot. And as the 3rd day ends, Ninshabar on the surface recognizes the time, sees the sunset, and waits. And when Inanna doesn't ascend, she picks up her drum. And within minutes, Enki, the earth itself, he represents soil and its pregnant creative power. He comes to her and says, I heard you drumming for help. What's going on? And she explains, Inanna descended and she hasn't come back. She told me to call for help. No one is coming. You're the only one who answered. And Enki and Inanna have a long history. He's pining for her, even though he'll never get her. And in fact, he loves her so much that in another wonderful tale, he actually gives her his May, his power, his divine understanding of the path of life, further strengthening her power as queen of heaven and earth. And he's a little upset about it, but deep down, he loves her so much. He's still showing up now to be the one to rescue her. And so he looks at Ninshabar and says, okay, here's what I'll do. And he goes and scrapes from under his fingernail a bit of this pure soil. And he shapes these two priestesses called Gala. And these Gala were assigned male at birth people that chose to dress as women. So today we might call them priestesses. We might call them trans women. At the time they were called Gala. And these two Gala go down with Ninshabar. And something very important for those on the priestess path, this frame drumming that she's doing continues throughout. So you can almost hear the bum, 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 bum as they're walking, okay? They're descending together into the underworld. Ninshabar knows she's immortal, but she knows she's safe as long as she's holding this beat. And through this descent, these two Gala lead the way. Enki is gone. He says, here's your help. Goodbye. To let me know how this goes. And the Gala proceed in front, and they actually are allowed through the gates because they're not seen as threats. They're just seen as souls because they're all mortal souls. And so they make it all the way to Eresh Kigal's throne. And when they get there, she is in horrible pain. She's in the birthing pains, and she's alone. Her husband's not with her. Her priestesses aren't there. And these two Gala priestesses who are there to save their mistress, they stop. And they don't even bring it up. They say, hey, are you okay? And her wails get louder, and they go on either side of her, and they hold her hands, and they help her through this labor as she delivers this baby. And as she's coming through it, and as she's feeling better, she's so grateful to them for being there when no one else could be. Ninshabar is drumming all the while. That she says to the two Gala, what do you want? Anything at all, even if it breaks the rules of heaven, earth, and underworld, I will give it to you. And they look up at the rotting corpse of Inanna on the hook, and they say, we want that. And she says, well, you asked for the one thing that's a little tricky, but okay, you can take her, but you have to bring someone in her place. And they say, okay, no worries. So they take Inanna off the hook, and they begin walking her back. And as she passes back through each of these gates, and then as she descends, she gains back her power stronger than ever. She regains all that she stripped off and more, because she is choosing what to layer back on. And when she rises to the surface, she finds that countless villagers and citizens of her town are mourning her. The temples are filled with wails, the incense is burning, the offerings are piled high, and she feels so loved. She says, wow, how can I ask? Oh, and so the Gala along the way told her, hey, unfortunately, a soul is going to have to go down there in your place. And so all the while she's thinking, well, okay, who am I going to ask to suffer like that for me? Who could I ask to die for me that way? And everyone's mourning and mourning and mourning. And she's like, well, these people love me so much. And then she gets to her throne. And who does she find upon it? Joyfully feasting, by the way, but her consort, Dumuzi. And she says, excuse me. And he says, huh? Oh, hey, you want some meat? She says, what? I've been gone. I've been in the underworld. Oh, that's right. Yeah. Good to see you. Well, needless to say, he was not mourning her. He was more than happy to have her throne and enjoy her feasts. And so she sends her consort, Dumuzi, in her place to the underworld. He sacrifices himself / is sacrificed for his hubris and disrespect. Inanna is now empowered as the queen of heaven and earth and the only goddess to descend and ascend. She is stronger for her descent. And her bond with her sister is now able to be healed because, in a way, they're even. Her priestesses served Ereshkigal in her hour of need, and Inanna served her penance. The end.
And this is a great example because I've heard a very different story. So the story I hear that I've even retold is the bull of heaven is the bull of heaven, and then Ereshkigal, they are that primordial heaven and earth combination. So when he dies, there's that void. So when Inanna has to reascend, she has to take on his mantle too. Mm-hmm. So that's where her power comes from, not necessarily from the morning, but so Nishkabar, it wasn't drumming, it was bloodletting. She had to mutilate herself as a show of that devotion to summon the Gala, who were the sacrifice.
Wow,
so they went down there
so different.
To replace. Yeah.
Do you know the source for that? Like where that comes from?
I don't. It's I've like heard many different versions of it, so it's kind of like my own personal gnosis of combining them together. But then when she sees her consort on the throne, dressed in his best attire, feasting, not missing her one bit, then she's like, "Oh, you're going back down there too." Like she punishes him in that way. So there was like 3 sacrifices for her one because of her power that she gained. And in the version that I've heard, it was when she went down there, it wasn't because she was seeking apology.
Yeah.
She wasn't seeking to make things right. She was there to gloat. Mm-hmm. She was there but she was kind of trying to save face, more of that aspect. So yeah, there was like, it's fun because we see like these different nuances that come out, and it depends on who's telling the story and, you know, how it's, you know, played out in the current zeitgeist. I don't know. Like, it's very interesting. I love it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's why I don't take anything like fully like, oh, this is how it is. It's not. There was a time I may have, but not anymore.
And even in translations, like the word could be like, she came with insert word here. We're going to translate that perhaps as conviction. Well, what does conviction mean? Depending who uses it and how, it could be forceful, aggressive conviction, or it could be reactionary conviction. So that's exactly where something that sounds so opposing, was she there to gloat or offer sympathy? Yeah. It's so opposing. And yet when it comes down to translating it, and also people, we're going off of like one way to translate. Like the Rosetta Stone is our answer to that. That was how we were able to translate this stuff. So it's very new. Yeah. It's very limited. And yeah.
And in the one version that I have read, when it talks about like, well, how did they get into that situation? How was the bull of heaven killed? And it was Inanna and her selfishness trying to seduce Gilgamesh, and her failure. He was not interested in her. He wanted nothing to do with her. And she was so enraged by that, she just started destroying things and warring. And yeah, so that's part of why Ereshkigal is so upset with her, because she caused his death. If she would just freaking chill out, you know, in that version of the story, if she would have just chilled out and accepted that not every man was, you know, falling all over himself for her, then everybody would be fine. But yeah, interesting. I love it. Like the different versions of the story. I love it.
Yeah. Yeah. You may have noticed that here at the Magick Kitchen Podcast, we don't have sponsored ads. That's because this is a fully listener-supported show. We do what we do for you, dear listener, and when you join my magical living community on Patreon, you're supporting all the time and energy that goes into setting up podcast interviews, writing articles and rituals, my paranormal mystery novel, and all that I do. If you love this podcast, consider joining my magical space. I can't wait to meet you and be an even bigger part of your magical journey. Go to patreon.com/Elyse Wells or follow the link in the show notes.
Story number 2? Okay. So I have a story for you all. And these stories are like based in like love and relationships because we're right around releasing this right around Valentine's Day. So I think it's a good idea to look at like different versions of love, not just this romantic love, but love for the things that we hold dear in our life.
Mm-hmm. Like Ninshabar.
So
I love her
exactly.
place in the myth. She gets so forgotten. Everybody identifies with Inanna. But in mythology, we really, to get the most out of it, we need to identify with every character.
And
Ninshabar as the priestess in dedication
to
That's
her
us.
love of her, the love of her deity.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, so this one is dedication, but to each other. So this is my version of the story of Tiamat and Abzu and their grandson Magick.
Also from Sumerian mythology, by the way.
It is Sumerian, Mesopotamian, Babylonian.
So, goes all the way.
So when
across.
you look at the evolution of this mythology, each culture had a different take on it. Each culture told it in a different way. And of course, the telling of it was like pictographs and glyphs. It wasn't told like written down words. So again, it's up for interpretation. But this story historically has been colored by the cultural and political persona of the world, the view of the world. So again, bringing this into the modern era, it's going to be colored by my perception of the world and my perception of this relationship that they have together. So imagine the vastness of the universe, dark, inky, black nothingness. But there's 2 points of light. One is dark and one is light. The dark creature that comes from this inky blackness, she is Namu. She is Tiamat. She is the great mother. Envision her as a great dragon of the stars. Her scales are like galaxies. Her eyes are sparkling like stars. Her mane and her claws are sharp and shiny and sleek. And her consort, Abzu, he is white, like starlight himself. Like 1,000 suns set into a great body. And as they travel through this inky blackness, they create their love for each other, their grooming of each other. Each time that they shed off scales and hair, Tiamat takes it into her giant claws and she breathes on it, creating suns, creating moons, creating planets, creating galaxies and solar systems. And as they travel through this inky blackness, their love for each other fuels this creation, the stars in the heavens, until one day, one millennia, who knows how long, the inky blackness is filled with glistening bright lights and churning seas of creation. And they decide one day that they want to have one creation that is solely their own. Because throughout this whole time, they have been traveling, they have their offspring managing the creations that they've created so that it's kind of like self-sustaining, nature. And they are able to kind of relax a little bit and create something that's solely for them, their own management system, their own galaxy. And they begin creating. They begin grooming each other, pulling off their scales and their hair, creating from these pieces of themselves. And they created this one sphere that was beautiful to them. Just absolutely beautiful, with green, big oceans and beauty beyond anything that they have done before. It was their one beautiful creation that they just fell in love with. And as they were tending to this new creation, their grandson, Magick, was the corrupter. Nobody really realized it because of the vastness that they had created. He was kind of just flitting around, touching here and there. And he didn't possess the ability to create, but he possessed the ability to corrupt, to manipulate. And so he was having fun. He thought it was a great thing to do, to go and destroy and manipulate and distort what others had created. And he found them. He found their one beautiful creation and decided he was going to go down and he was going to start manipulating it. And it took a while before Tiamat discovered what was happening. And when she did, she sent Abzu to talk to him. Go talk to our grandson. What's he doing? Why is he doing this? Why is he not creating like the rest of us? Why is he destroying? Why is he manipulating? Why is he destroying what we've created together? So Abzu goes to speak with him. And Magick wants nothing to do with it. He's like, no, this is what I do. Bugger off, old man. I want nothing to do with you. This is what I do. And I don't care if it's yours. I'm going to do what I want with it. So that infuriated Abzu because this was his expression of love to his mate, to his consort. So Abzu goes back and talks to Tiamat, and she's like, okay, let me think on this. And as they deliberated and tried to figure out a good solution for this, like what to do with Magick. How do we stop him from destroying everything that everyone is creating? And before they knew it, Magick attacked. He began fighting with Abzu. And they took this fight all over the planet that they had created. And keep in mind, this is a huge planet. These are huge beings. And it began destroying the planet. And Abzu realized it. We're destroying this planet. We're destroying this creation. And that was kind of Magick's little he moment. I got you to destroy your own creation. So Abzu called a truce. He said, no, we're not doing this. And he walked away from the fight, which infuriated Magick. He wanted to fight. He wanted the chaos. He wanted the dismay. And Abzu said, nope, we're not doing this. So Abzu tried to make his way back to Tiamat. And in the process, he's repairing what was destroyed. So it's taking him a little bit longer to get back to Tiamat. And as Abzu laid down to rest from his creation and his fighting, Magick saw his opportunity. And he drew up a great axe and cleaved Abzu in half from tip to tail. And as soon as Tiamat realized what happened, she collected the bones and the body of her beloved and tucked him away to keep him safe so she could go address this with Magick. So again, Magick is engaging in battle, but this time with Tiamat because she's furious now. She is enraged. She's seen the destruction that's been caused. She has seen what she's done to her consort, what he's done to her consort. And she is in a fury. So as she is trying to stop the destruction, now the destruction is ramped up because Magick has gotten what he wants. He's infuriated her, and she is the most powerful being in this entire story. And he is using that power against everything she's created. So after who knows how long they fought, she looks around and sees her beloved and her beloved creation in ruins. It is completely destroyed. There is nothing left. No more seas, no more land, no more green, no more blue. It is black. It is gray. It is oozing with dismay. And she stops. And she's like, what do I do? How do I fix this? So she turned to her magic. She turned to her abilities to transmute and create. And she stopped Magick and said, look, we've got to stop this. We're destroying everything. And he's like, sorry, not stopping because I love this. This is what I live for. I live for the destruction. And she decided right then and there, no, not doing it anymore. So she gathered up the body of her beloved and used her magic and cast one final spell that would change the tide of everything. And she, holding the body of her consort, she surrendered to Magick with the condition that as soon as he cleaved her body in half, her body would create the earth. her blood would become the sea. The blood of her beloved, her consort, would become the water of the rivers. Their bones would become the land and the mountains. Their hair would become the grasses and trees. So as Magick swung his great axe and cleaved her in two, the spell was set. And their bodies became heaven and earth. And Magick was part of the spell. He now was in stewardship of this earth, but he could no longer fully create it. He could create pockets of chaos. He could create pockets of dismay. But no matter how hard he tried, her last spell prevented him from completely destroying it. So what he did is he turned to corrupting the creatures, the two-legged beings of the earth, and working on them to corrupt. And that is how we ended up on planet Earth. So that is our creation myth in that story. So in that story, the sacrifice of the things you love, not only for each other, but for the things you create. And that, again, I think it demonstrates that critical thinking. Like, okay, how do I solve this problem in the most creative way? And in some texts I've read, the theory is the Magick is the current personified the god of Christianity. He is the corrupter, the trickster. So, yeah, depending on where you get the source from, there's definitely like some parallels there. And yeah, that's one of my favorite stories.
It's so interesting too because Sumerian mythology was, by and large, essentially rewritten during the time of Enheduanna's priestesshood. So her father, Sargon, was the emperor of Sumeria who had the idea that they should colonize. And so in those 50 years, that was when she understood. She watched it happen as the high priestess at Ur's most major temple. And these temples weren't just places where you popped in, said hi to the goddess, and left. It was the center of society. If you remember in Christian myth, if you ever grew up in that culture, you might have remembered like Jesus destroying the temple. It was because they had a marketplace in it, and he believed he was the first one. Supposedly, you know, it's a myth again, but he says that that's bad. Temples should be places of worship only. And that came from the fact that temples traditionally were places, were places of congregation and knowledge.
Yeah. They were part of the everyday life. They were pivotal. It's where
the cattle were raised, where you would sell and trade goods, where you would hold marriage ceremonies, where you would hold essentially notaries were held there. Yeah. So everything you needed, the courthouse, everything was at the temple. And she watched all this go down. She watched colonization happen. And she was the one receiving the refugees coming as Akkad was attacked and brought into Sumer. And we see that syncretism of their cultures. That's what happened. And so the mythology of Tiamat and Apsu as like destroyers and and now they're destroyed by Marduk and he has to cleave them apart. And it gets very violent because it comes from that legacy of like violence is the answer that Sargon of Sumer believes.
And that's one of the pivotal instances where Tiamat is looked as the chaos camp. She's looked at this destroyer instead of the creatrix that she
she's perverted in these myths.
She's perverted
So it's
and that's usually what we hear.
And even our primary source is patriarchal there, and it's an example of how this train's been going a long time, y'all.
A long time.
It's been going a long time. And if you are curious, like where the roots of that are, we know it comes from tribes being usurped by hegemonies, by colonizers. And that's what we see in Enheduanna's poetry. We see a mobilization for the first time of people being able to stand up for their rights, regardless of their affiliation and tribe. We see that taken away when Sumer begins colonizing. So that loss is what she's chronicling. And that lens of, I'm a high priestess of Inanna, you can't not listen to me. That power she had, that platform she had. I identify with that a lot. I think that's why we can't not talk about these things. We can't put our heads in the sand about politics. We can't turn it off. We can't leave social media despite all the things people might want to do about that. Like, we have to show up and we have to be present, and community is where we'll find our salvation. It's always been the case.
Merry meet,
merry part, and merry meet again.
Thank you for joining us on the Magick Kitchen Podcast. Please visit my website, leandrawitchwood.com, for news, information, and more episodes.
I'm Elyse Wells, and I can be found at Seeking Numina on YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook, and seekingnumina.com. That's Seeking, Numina.